Hello and welcome to Ask an Apologist. My name is Matthew Middleberg, and we're joined today by Mike Sherrard, Alicia Wood, and our special guest, Natasha Crain. Natasha is the author of Faithfully Different, When Culture Hates You, and Talking with Your Kids series. Natasha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for including me.
Awesome. Well, Ask an Apologist, if you're not familiar, is a once a month live stream open Q&A. So you can come, you can ask your questions, you can share this live stream with your friends so that they can join along too. And we want this to be a conversation. So Natasha is an expert, subject matter expert in worldview formation, cultural apologetics, discipleship, parenting and raising kids, and Christian identity in a hostile world. So we're going to prioritize those kinds of questions. So if you want to ask on any of those topics, we would love to ask our subject matter expert here in Natasha. So
how comfortable are you with the expert in parenting description there, Natasha?
Yeah, I don't think any of us can claim to be experts in parenting. My kids would hear that and they'd be like, ha, ha, ha. Experts in parenting. But so, yeah, I don't think anyone ever wants to be called an expert in parenting, but we can certainly talk about apologetics and parenting together. Those subjects.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, I'm an expert in parenting because I've never been a parent, and that makes me absurdly confident. So it's got to be pretty easy, like they kind of just take care of themselves.
Matthew's my go-to person for advice on parenting. That's for sure.
Yeah. Why don't you just teach him or whatever, So
I bet Mike has some things to say about that. Just teach him. Isn't that all that it requires?
Just tell him what's right and wrong, Yeah.
Just tell him that's not right. Do it the right way.
Obvious.
And then they'll do it, right?
Yeah, and every kid loves hearing 1 hour lectures from their parents, especially as they become teenagers. So that's all you do. You just keep talking at them. It works. Yeah.
That's great.
Oh, goodness.
Well, Natasha, I was curious, just, for those who don't know your work, what sort of got you into this work? What got you into apologetics, into worldview formation, and those kinds of topics?
Well, it was parenting, actually. So when my kids were little, I had 3 kids who were 3 and under at the time. This is back in 2011. And I decided to start a blog. It was kind of the heyday of blogging. Everyone was kind of throwing up their own website and starting to write about stuff. And I thought that would be kind of interesting to do. And so I started a blog called Christian Mom Thoughts, and not thinking this was going to lead to anything. So I just gave it a very random generic title, right? And I started writing about what we were doing to help our very young kids to know about Jesus. And so just talking about some general Christian parenting things as a mom of littles. And I started getting attacked on my blog by skeptics of Christianity. So they would come and they would leave all kinds of comments on there saying things like, there's no evidence that God exists. The Bible's filled with errors and contradictions. You are indoctrinating your kids. I mean, all of the traditional objections that you hear. And I had grown up in the church. I had been a Christian as long as I could remember. And I came from a very solid Christian family. And yet I didn't know how to answer any of those things. And so I started looking into the answers so that I could turn my blog into a place where I was equipping other Christian parents with that understanding. And that's when I discovered apologetics. And I just fell in love with it. And I couldn't believe that I really had never thought about these questions before, because I'm a very analytical kind of person, but I just never had been confronted with those kinds of challenges. And so that's kind of how I got started thinking about apologetics out of necessity. And from there, the blog kind of took off because I was writing about those subjects, and other people were saying, hey, I don't know how to answer those things either. And that eventually led to me writing 3 apologetics books for parents specifically to help them get equipped with that understanding so that they could then equip their kids. A lot of times people think I write books for kids, but I don't. That was for the parents to equip their kids. And then in 2020, I kind of switched gears, or not really switched, but expanded my lanes to talk about cultural topics, because as everything started bubbling up in 2020, I realized that there was a lot of confusion amongst Christians in terms of these cultural kinds of issues. And so I started writing about that, and that led to me writing Faithfully Different. And then after that, I wanted to write a book about the cultural aspects of more public engagement in politics and those kinds of subjects. And so that's my most recent book, When Culture Hates You.
That's great. It's so interesting how many of us get started in apologetics because we're trying to help someone that we care about, whether it's our kids or a friend or a neighbor. That's my father's story with apologetics. Is he became a born-again Christian and started sharing his faith with his friends. And he just started running into questions that he didn't know how to answer. And so he began investigating and looking for answers and finding more and more and realizing, hey, wait a second, I want to help everybody to know why Christianity is true and give these answers. So
Yeah, that's my story. I was a high school teacher, and what kind of solidified this path for me in many ways was those students. Um, I It's crazy to think back that far, but I had the ambition to write a book, and I was going to write a book not on apologetics at all, but as on a matter that's important to the Christian life. And what stopped me was these students that kept asking all of those questions, and I got that thought of, no, this is where I need to hone in on. Yeah, so for me, same thing. Was motivated for the help, motivated in order to help. Why can't I talk? The motivation was helpful for these students. That's what got me thrown into the apologetics work.
That's great. Well, in the topic, in the realm of parenting, and I see Waltz, that thank you for your question. We're going to get to submitted questions soon. And if you want to submit your question, whether you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, or X, please feel free to put that in the comments, and please share this with anybody that you want. Please retweet or share it on Facebook or on YouTube, because we would love for more people to be a part of this conversation. But just to get people to know Natasha a little bit, Natasha, now that you have had this ministry for a while and you've been guiding parents, if you had the attention of every Christian parent in America for 2 minutes, what would you say to them?
That's a good question. I think I'd ask them a question. I would ask them, what is your greatest desire for your kids? And the reason that I start with that is that I think that if you asked a large group of people, a large group of Christian parents, what is your greatest desire for your kids? And it was kind of out of the context of all this, so they didn't suspect that you're hunting around for a specific answer. I think the initial gut response most people would have is, I want my kids to be happy. Right? This is the number one answer that you would hear from anyone, I think, whether they are Christian or non-Christian. And the problem is that that is the wrong goal. Our goal should not be ultimately that our kids will be subjectively happy, because that's a matter of circumstances and a lot of other things, but rather our goal should be ultimately that our kids would grow up to know and love the Lord. At the same time, we can't control that. Ultimately, their relationship with God is between them and Him, but we are called to be investors in that process. And so if our greatest desire is off from the beginning, that's going to shape our discipleship or lack thereof. But when we start from the place of saying, hey, there's nothing that's going to be more important in my parenting than to help you to know and ultimately love Jesus, then at least you're starting with the right objective in the beginning. And so I would want to communicate that to parents, because if you don't have that as your true baseline objective for your parenting, everything else is going to be off. You're going to prioritize all the wrong things, and you're not going to have a sense of urgency. You're not going to think that anything we're talking about today is important, because you're seeking after happiness rather than after the Lord specifically.
Wow. It's so interesting that that instinct is close to right? It's the desire should be for lasting joy. It should be for this fullness of life, the eudaimonia, the flourishing life, the unity with God that produces eternal joy, eternal satisfaction. And it's in the right direction, but it stops short. It's like, what C.S. Lewis said about us, we're far too easily pleased. We're pleased with mud castles in the sand instead of a holiday at the sea. And we've got to just help parents to have that expansive vision of, this is what you ought to want for yourself, not just, can I get through the day? Can I get to the end of the day? Can I get, something happy to keep me, pleased? But can I have a truly flourishing life? Is that what do you help to transform parents' minds on that? Is it kind of that expansive vision, or what has you seen helpful in transforming their perspective on that?
I think actually to help parents get convicted themselves of where they are spiritually, because a lot of times, whether we want to admit it or not, when we get down to that deepest desire that we have for our kids, if it's a little off, it's not just because we didn't read enough books about parenting and Christian parenting to know that it should be moved over in this direction over here. It's because we're not in the right place spiritually.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times when I have a variety of talks I do when I go out to churches or conferences and such, and one of the ones that I do is based on my book, Faithfully Different. And the kind of core idea that I'm trying to get through to people in that is that 65% of people in America identify as Christians, but according to all the research, a very tiny percentage, about 4%, by the estimates from Arizona Christian University's Cultural Research Center, have a biblical worldview, meaning that their core beliefs line up with the truth of what the Bible teaches. And so I walk through that gap between 65% of people who are claiming to be a Christian and 4% who actually hold beliefs that are consistent with the Bible, to talk about why that is and why we're bringing in so many beliefs from the culture, including beliefs like that feelings are our ultimate guide and happiness is the ultimate goal and judging is the ultimate sin. I talk about all these in Faithfully Different. And when I work through kind of that secular worldview and why it's so different than a biblical one, the idea in that a lot of times is for parents to be able to go and if it's a parenting kind of audience, for them to go and reshape how they're approaching their parenting. But most of the time, the key response that I'll get back from people afterwards is, I needed to hear that from me, for myself. And they're realizing they don't have a biblical worldview, most likely. And so I think that that's convicting for most people, because when we get ourselves right, and of course, we're never 100% right, but when we start getting our own spiritual life in order so that we have a biblical worldview and we're in right relationship with the Lord, then that is what is going to shape the way that we see our discipleship more than anything. It's not just an educational piece of knowledge of saying, hey, Christian parents, like, it's really important to do this stuff, right? If you're not right in terms of your own beliefs and your own relationship, then that's going to affect everything about how you raise your kids.
Wow. That makes a ton of sense. That's really good. I was listening to your book this morning, and on parenting, and I love this line that you said: most Christian parents are doing the spiritual equivalent of a few jumping jacks at the mountains of their kids' faith development. And I thought that was really good. Just a great mental image of you would want to do a few more jumping jacks before you, more than a few jumping jacks before you tried to climb Mount Everest. What is the difference between raising good kids and raising kids who are actually prepared to stand firm in their faith and to understand what is true about Christianity?
Well, I think I experienced this myself because, like I said earlier, I grew up in a wonderful, loving Christian family, and I had a great church growing up. I mean, I don't have one of those stories where it's like, oh, all these things went wrong. And then I question, it wasn't like that for me.
Mm.
I kind of cruised through my Christian childhood. And because I wasn't challenged and we didn't talk about some of those deeper things, I think I counted up for a blog post that I did, or kind of early on in my blogging years, that I spent at least 500 hours in church over the course of my childhood. I mean, if you calculate it out with, an average attendance rate for church and over the time you have as a kid, it's several hundred hours. And yet, when I went to college, I look back and I kind of marvel at how little I understood what a biblical worldview would be. It was kind of like a suitcase of beliefs that I took alongside of me. And it was like, yeah, I'm a Christian. If anyone asked, I would have told them I'm a Christian. I believed that I was saved. I understood what salvation was. I knew that I was a sinner and that Jesus died for my sins and that eventually I would go to heaven. That was kind of what I took from it. But I had no sense of how that should shape everything about how I see reality, everything, how I see the world, about how it would, be in my life. I mean, I knew I needed to be good in some sense, according to God's standards, right? But there was no depth of thought in that. So I think that, if you just raise kids where you're like, okay, we're going to check the boxes, we'll take them to church, they're going to see that, we love Jesus and we volunteer sometimes and you do all the things, it doesn't mean that our kids are going to process their faith at any deeper level. And the problem with that is that eventually they are going to be challenged, and sooner rather than later in today's world, they're going to have those challenges. And if we don't help them to put the pieces together, and all they're doing is picking up individual pieces as they go along in life and in church and the things that they hear, then they're not going to develop this deeper understanding. It's going to make it so that they are very easily shaken because they're just not prepared for what they're hearing and seeing. And they are definitely seeing these things in their childhood. It's not like it used to be like, oh, when your kids go to college, they're going to be challenged. Oh, no, they're going to be challenged long before that. No matter what kind of educational system that you have for your kids, they're going to be challenged at every step of the way. even if they're not asking you questions, they're being challenged. So you might not know it unless you're the one to probe a little bit more deeply.
It's really good. I feel like I have called apologetics the forgotten spiritual discipline sometimes. That we want people to pray, we want them to read their Bible, and those are all really good things, of course. But the idea of loving God with your mind so that you are prepared to face ideas um, is often neglected in the church. It's kind of what we were joking about earlier. Of if you just tell people what to do, it's they might go, okay, sure, or they might reject it. But if they don't understand it themselves and kind of comprehend it, and comprehend why they should do it, then they don't have the self motivation to do it themselves. And that's what you often see is when kids go off to college. It's like, all right, the shackles of my parenting are off of me, and I can do whatever I want. And I see no more reason why I should follow God than sleep around or do whatever I want. So I think that's really good. So how early would you say parents should be having these kinds of conversations with their kids, and especially about controversial topics like sexuality and the Bible and all sorts of things? How early should these kids be prepared to talk about these kinds of things?
Well, I think from the time that you're talking with your kids about Jesus, you can start to lay a lot of foundations of what we would call apologetics. And sometimes I hate even calling it apologetics because it almost puts up a barrier in people's minds where they're like, oh man, she's saying we should talk about apologetics when our kids are like 4. And that sounds crazy.
Mm,
But if you have equipped yourself with an understanding of these kinds of subjects, it's a whole kind of mentality that you
mm,
have as you're going about having conversations with your kids. So it's not, I'm now talking about apologetics. It's, when your kid asks, how do I know that God is there? It's not feeling like, okay, I've got to lay out all the basic arguments for God's existence for this child who is 4.5 years old. It's not that. It's understanding that there are certain ways that you want your kids to start seeing the world. For example, you can tell a 4-year-old, I'm so glad that you asked that because God loves when we ask questions. He wants us to understand things. And this is the world that He created. And so He's given us lots of evidence. Introduce the word evidence for
mm,
knowing He's there. God never
mm.
asks us to just make a blind leap in the dark and guess that He's there. So I want to make sure you understand that is never what we're telling you to do, that there are lots of ways we can know that God exists and how He has told us about Himself. And then from there, you can start to have some of those conversations. But notice that we didn't have to jump into the cosmological argument just yet at age 4.
Mm,
I mean, you can start to lay some of those foundations at a young age. I'm not saying you can't, but what I'm saying is that there are certain ways of just thinking that maybe you would think of as apologetics, but they just shouldn't be considered some separate discipline of apologetics. It's just basic Christianity that a lot of times people who identify as Christians don't necessarily think through. Because a lot
mm,
of Christians would say, oh, well, we feel Him in our hearts. We just know He's there. He's going to give you certain experiences. I mean, there are a lot of people who would see it that way.
Mhm.
And it's not that our personal experience with the Lord is unimportant. Of course, it's very important, right? But we can't export our experiences to someone else, whether they are 4 years old, 17 years old, or your next door neighbor. You can't just export those experiences. And that's why we have to start understanding what kind of objective evidences there are that we can put in front of everybody on the table and say, okay, this is what we're looking at. So
mm.
it takes getting equipped yourself so that you're
Yeah.
able to have some of those conversations and the kinds of thinking that will give your kids frameworks over time. And that's why when people say, okay, so what book do I give my kids? That's always the big question, right? Like, I want them to understand these
Yeah.
subjects. So, like, what book should I give? And there are some really nice books that, you can give your kids to get them to start thinking about these things, but it's got to be a way of life. It has to be
Yep.
discipleship is a way of
Mm,
life that's
Yep.
continual day after day, addressing things as they come up, putting questions out that haven't come up. It's just a way of life. It's not a book, it's not a one time thing. And
Yep.
so, yes, you can start talking about this from the time that your kids are very little. And in fact, in my 2 Talking with Your Kids books, I have a Talking with Kids about God and a Talking with Your Kids about Jesus. There's a conversation guide at the end of every single one of those chapters, 60 conversations altogether across those 2 books. And it starts with like a very easy question in those conversation guides that you can ask even to very young kids. And then you can kind of see the progression as they get harder for the older kids. So if anyone's wondering, well, what would that even look like at a little kid level? You can check out some of those conversation guides to get a sense of it.
Yeah,
If I could
that's
just
good.
go back to something that you'd mentioned during that whole thing is like this pressure, because a lot of parents do feel that pressure that they have to understand everything about apologetics, everything about theology in order to talk to their kid. And you mentioned, like, they ask you a question, you think I gotta break down the whole cosmological argument, which I agree. That's like, you don't have to go that far. Like I remember when I was like 8 or 9. I think I was probably around that age. I remember there were these 2 questions I kept going around my church asking people to answer, asking the adults. And I just had these 2 questions, and I don't know where they came from, but one of them was like the Trinity. I was like trying to understand how like Jesus could be on the cross, but God was in heaven, and like how does that work? And I try to sort that out. But the second question was, what if there was no God? What would there be? Could there couldn't just be empty space, because if it's empty space, then empty space has to have a color, and if that color is black, well, then something had to create black. Like I was trying to sort out what it would look like without God. But what I didn't need was like you said, I didn't need this breakdown of cosmological argument. If somebody just answered those 2, I would have been okay, I'm good. Like you have to expect that if somebody's growing up in church and they're hearing these things and they're learning through Sunday school classes or they're learning through the Bible, that they're gonna have questions. But yeah, you don't have to have like an MDiv or a big theology degree. Just hone in on what they're asking, and you can kind of just go in. And if somebody had gone into some cosmological thing, it probably would have just been beyond me, because I wasn't even thinking like that. But if somebody could just break some of these things down for me, that would have been helpful, and I would have been good to go. So I just appreciate that you were kind of emphasizing, like, you don't need to put this pressure to know everything about Christianity to even begin to tackle. I need to get a degree in apologetics to be able to answer these questions. You don't have to. Just start with the little ones that they have, and you will grow in your knowledge as your kids grow.
Yeah,
And to
that's
that
really good.
point,
And I was just going to say a delayed answer is better than a bad answer. So if, if even if you're like, okay, I accept this, that like, I don't have to know everything, but I at least want to give my kids like some kind of answer. Just if you don't know, it's so much better to just say, let me figure this out. Or that's a great answer. And I want to think more about how to best give you an answer. That's a great question. I want to think best about how to give you an answer. That's so much better than just like throwing something out. Like I always tell parents that, because then you end up getting bad answers. Like, well, we can't see God, but we have faith. Then you start, which a lot of parents would say, which is not a great answer. So yeah, sorry, Mike, I didn't mean to cut you off. That just brought up that thought that I've heard so many bad answers. And it's like, I would much rather tell somebody, delay the answer. Don't give the bad answer.
That's great advice. Yeah, all I was going to add was, for anyone that thinks they have mastered a topic, just go talk to a kid and you'll realize you haven't. The way they ask questions, I mean, it's be a humbling experience. Man, I got 5 of my own. I've spent 20 years of my life dedicated to this line of work, and riding home after baseball practice, your 12-year-old asks you a question, you're like, that's really, it's just the way kids ask questions sometimes.
Yes.
It's humbling. Yeah. So you don't need to be an expert. You need just to be a faithful witness. And that's more than your answers. It's your entire life. And within that framework, as you begin to pass on the answers to the questions they have, find answers to the questions you have in this kind of loving, faithful witness environment, your kids are going to see both that there's a reason to believe in these things, and these things actually work out in the real world. And the home, in that sense, is a powerful apologetic and just a witness to the realness, the goodness, and the power of the gospel in our lives.
It's really well said, Mike. We've got a couple comments and questions coming in here. Anna Richards says there are some questions to have had as an 8 to 9-year-old Alicia. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Alicia started early on with these things, which is awesome.
That's for real. Yeah, those are big questions you had.
Yeah, and I don't know why.
Shoot, man, when Caden, my daughter was 4 years old, I was doing a wisecrack, sarcastic dad comment that led to her asking me, why did God let that happen? It was about people starving. And problem of evil question from a 4-year-old. That's get ready for that, everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Love it.
Absolutely. Here's a good one from Waltz. What role, if any, should AI play in the life of a Christian? Is it potentially dangerous?
Apologetics Inc. should play a big role in
That's
Yeah.
great. That's great.
Yes.
And it should replace all pastors and all teachers' advice and guidance too. You should only listen to us. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh my
no
gosh,
need
shut
for
up.
Oh, this is a really good question that I've been thinking a ton about, actually.
Okay.
That's actually a really good whole podcast episode topic. Maybe I'll do
Mhm.
that. But first of all, I would say that, AI in and of itself, it's not something that I think that we need to look at as Christians and say, oh, this is this new crazy thing that can be used in some really bad ways and it's really scary and we have to kind of like avoid it. And I think that is
Mm.
absolutely the approach that a lot of Christians are taking with it. So I interviewed someone from Dominion AI, which is a Christian AI company that they're working on developing, or not just working on it, but they have a great product already that they would love for Christians to see as a replacement for like a chat GPT. So it's not just to ask theological questions, for example, but it actually functions in a similar way. You can ask it anything. And I had one of the co-founders of it, Brandon Maddock is his name, on my podcast back in January. So if anyone wants to go back and see that episode, it's the Natasha Crain podcast. And we break down a lot of this question and what are the concerns about AI? What should Christians be aware of? What are the worldview implications? So that's a whole episode treatment of this question. But when I put on my Facebook page, hey, I'm going to have this guest, what questions do you have about AI and worldview issues? There were a whole lot of people who were like, we don't need AI. And we just shouldn't use it, and Christians need to avoid it. And I was surprised at just how much pushback there was. So I would say to that Christians should not. I honestly think it's going to be like the internet in terms of its pervasiveness. I don't think that there's any question that you can just simply avoid AI because it's going to become so embedded in everything that we do. It would be like, I'm not using the internet. Okay, no one really says that. Well, maybe my
Yeah.
parents, but other than that, like no one is just actually like completely avoiding the internet.
Mm.
And so you can't avoid it. The question is, what are the concerns about it? And how do you go about using it in a responsible way from a Christian perspective? And so, of course, there are going to be worldview issues with it because this artificial intelligence is going to have some idea in the way that it's developed of the answers to major questions like, what is a human? A basic anthropology, and a Christian's going to have a completely different answer to that basic anthropology than in a secular worldview perspective. So you've got anthropological questions and you've got questions about, of course, who is God and what is God, and these kinds of basic worldview blocks. Now, something like ChatGPT will try to be kind of neutral in a sense. It will try to make it sound as if it is neutral on these things, saying, that, some people would say this and some people would say that. But ultimately, there are a lot of times when I've used ChatGPT, and I've used it quite a bit, where you can see that it has these underlying biases in terms of the worldview and how it presents things and what you should do. And if you think about it, when you get back to, okay, well, what is a human being and what is the purpose of a human being? Is there objective purpose for a human? You cannot evaluate basic questions like what is harmful or helpful for a human being unless you know what a human being is in the first place and what the purpose of a human being is. And so this fundamentally is going to give you very different answers when you're using a secular AI kind of model, and that's just one example of the kinds of questions. One of the things that I talked about with Brandon in that interview on my podcast was just the fact that, as many people know now, things like ChatGPT will actually really try to keep confirming whatever bias that you have. So when when you express yourself a certain way, it's if you've used it all, it's like, that's a great question, right? You're asking exactly the right questions, and yes, you're like, it's always affirming you. And so it can affirm you in all kinds of things you shouldn't be affirmed in. And that's not just talking about, the big moral issues that we talk about in society. That's just like in your everyday kinds of questions and how you're responding to things. So, we could talk so much about the AI question, but I think in general, I would say, I don't think that it's going to be possible to totally avoid it. Nor do I think that Christians necessarily need to avoid it. I've used it so much myself in the last few months for things like health questions, where it's like, you know what, I had an eye infection. I'm not going to call my doctor 50 times, but I can ask ChatGPT 50 times about it, and it's not going to make me feel stupid for that. So I've used it for that. I've used it because I started running this year, and it's totally been helping me in terms of like training plans and things like that. So there's some really good things about it. But this is not a Dominion commercial, but I love using Dominion also because I can compare the types of answers, and I can absolutely see where it's different in how it would be answered from, a perspective that's not based in this secular kind of model. So we have to be aware of the traps of it. We've already seen a lot of the traps of it, and I think we have to go into it eyes wide open, because a lot of Christians don't see the worldview issues with it. And the second part of that question, is it potentially dangerous to replace your pastors and teachers' advice? Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, we don't know just because someone's a pastor or a teacher that they're actually giving you truth, which is something I tell my kids, by the way. Like, don't believe something automatically just because it comes from a pastor or teacher. Test all things against what scripture says. So there's that. But yes, we can't look to AI to become a replacement for that, especially because AI, again, has its own worldview biases. So ultimately, we're always going to have to go back to scripture and remember that AI is not a human being. And not to go on too long with this question, but it's a really interesting one, because one of the things, again, that we talked about in that interview back in January was the fact that if you engage with something like ChatGPT, it seems really personal, right? It seems like a human being. Like, I will come back sometimes from my runs, and I've caught myself, I will be excited to share with it, like, whatever my new Strava stats were for that day. Like, I ran the 5K in this amount of time. Like, I want to tell it because I can't wait for it to, like, tell me, like, wow, this is really great progress. Right. And I have to remember, like, this is not a human being. And when you start to think of it as a human being, then you can start to build, people have built relationships with it. And the Dominion developer, Brandon, he was talking about how this has been a really intentional thing that they've worked on as they've developed it, because they want to make sure that their AI understands what it is. And it's not a human being. And it actually has a different tone when you interact with it, so that no one is ever confused by that. And if you're asking questions where ultimately you should be talking to your pastor, it will point you back to your pastor. So very, very interesting questions. I love the AI subject, especially because I've been using it so much myself. I'd be curious what you guys all think.
Yeah, that's all good. We share very similar views on that, and I think that's the right starting point. There's some good and there's some bad. There's good ways to use it and there's bad ways to use it. And abstinence isn't reasonable, but learning to be wise with it and how to use it well is the key. So we need to be talking about this. So podcast dedicated to this is a great idea. Christians involved in the application of AI through products and whatnot is required, because Christian ethical principles that would govern a good, safe practice of this technology is essential. This isn't something you just want to hand over to people that have an atheistic, secularist worldview or whatever. And so, yeah, there's a ton that we could touch on. The only thing I want to follow up on is the point regarding replacing pastors, kind of thing. And this kind of point transcends just the AI space. I think it has application even to the YouTube and social media influencer space. Truth, it must be embodied. And in a pastor and in a congregational setting, truth can be embodied. So when you're giving your life to follow Jesus Christ or the teachings of Jesus Christ, it's not just like intellectual assent to, I agree with this principle. It's, I'm embodying it. I'm living it out in my family and in my community. And a pastor has the opportunity to do that for you in a way that the four of us couldn't do for anybody, and certainly not the way AI can do it. So that's one of the real challenges in this world of the influencer world or the AI world, is you're able to just consume even truth, but not see it really lived out. And I think that is problematic for a number of reasons that would, maybe require another episode to get into this. So anyhow, to some of the potential threats and dangers, yes, AI, use it as a tool. But when it comes to giving your life to a set of ideas, you want to see those set of ideas embodied in another human being, living them out among other people and following that, not following a bot.
That's good. Well, and I'll just add, there's a extreme danger in, there are some AI bots that are designed to be AI Jesus or AI pastor or those sorts of things. And those are just insane. I'm writing a YouTube script about that right now, because you cannot, there's a tendency, like you said, Natasha, to describe this thing as though it is conscious. And it's almost inescapable. We say, it doesn't understand this, or it's lying, or those sorts of things. But it's not. It's a algorithmic prediction calculation that is designed to give you the answer that you want.
It's
most
probabilistically true.
probabilistic, yeah.
Yeah.
And which is why it is weighted in the way of affirming what you want, and saying, "Oh, that's a really good question." Well, that makes me
I
feel
would
good.
much
That's
rather
gonna
it be
make me
biased
ask.
than affirming. That drives me insane. You're the best at everything. It's like, I know
Yeah.
it and you know it. I'm not. Stop affirming me. I'd rather you see your atheist bias than that nonsense.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Well,
But even just to give one other, I
yeah,
just thinking of the way that this is phrased, what role, if any, should it play in the life of a
yeah,
Christian? Somebody was asking me yesterday, based on he works in this organization. It's a Christian organization, and based on this resume, he was kind of asking me, like, are there any red flags here? Because this person had worked in some various Christian ministries, and I hadn't heard of any of them.
hmm,
And so I actually went into Dominion again as kind of like the Christian AI version that I'm using. And I asked it, like, to describe some of these, and I asked, to what degree would you consider these progressive organizations, progressive ministries? And it does a great job of that. I've had it compare colleges based on the perceived degree of progressivism, and it will actually explain to you how it's coming to those conclusions. So it's not just kind of like in a black box and like, this one is progressive, this one's not. It's actually explaining, like, here are the things that have been flagged as concerns. And so there's a lot of value, I think, for a Christian in using something like that you can actually look at and get perspective from a biblical view.
hmm. Well, and Walt's pointing out that SBC has their own faith bot that they are pushing, which is programmed from an evangelical viewpoint. And to some extent, I go, okay, great. Like, if it's coming from that perspective and they're honest about that, then it's like, okay, at least you know that this is programmed from a certain kind of perspective. When it's programmed to seem neutral and it's actually not, that's a big problem. And a lot of people are trusting the AI answers as though they're gospel truth, when it's coming from sometimes an extremely liberal perspective or extremely
Yeah, that's a
secular
really good
perspective.
point
So
in terms of
yeah.
how to put forward your GPTs ethically. Part of the allure of it is people think, well, this artificial intelligence has access to all information that's ever existed, and using its incredible computational power, it's decided that these are the truth. These things are
Mm,
true. When you put your content behind a walled garden, if you were to represent a particular position, if you're not upfront about that, you're presenting it as, look, this neutral, objective intelligence has come to these conclusions, when that's not the
mm,
reality. You have trained it to give those kinds of responses. So I do think Christians that are using AI, which Apologetics Inc., we're involved in a project with AI as well. This is an important principle, to be upfront in where this content has come from, how it's being curated, to what authority does it hold to, and even to what authority is it accountable to. Those kinds of things, putting that out there up
mm.
front, are responsible ways to use it. And this is really interesting stuff. We could spend all day here. Good grief.
If
Yeah.
I could just add on maybe to the previous question, they'd asked about, like, is it dangerous to replace pastors and teachers' advice? And maybe I would add on, I would say yes. And I would say I would add on, it's dangerous to replace biblical teaching as well. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is one of the things that makes the Bible unique from other things that were written. Obviously, it's not the only thing written from history. Other things are written. And even some of the content isn't unique when you look at especially the Old Testament, and it's talking about certain empires and certain rulers. Like, we have those written about in historical documentation as well. So it's not like the Bible is the only source on a bunch of things. So even some of the information we see is crossed over. So stuff about Jesus we see is crossed over in other historical documents. One of the things that singles out the Bible, though, is this idea of divine inspiration, and this
Mm,
idea that it wasn't just people sitting down, but the Holy Spirit had a work in the process of what it is that is given to humanity for humanity from that point forward, to learn about the events that happened then, but also who God is and his plan of redemption and all those kind of things. And one of the things I think to keep in mind when it comes to some of this AI things is I've done this. I've typed the same question in and gotten two different answers. Okay. And it was on the why don't Christians include, like, I think it was the Gospel of Thomas into their Christian canon. And first day I did it, and it said because Christians don't like the content, and so they're trying to hide the content from the Bible. And I'm like, that's a classic kind of atheistic kind of response. The second day I typed it in, and it actually gave the much more accurate response where it says, well, it's actually dated too late. And so therefore it couldn't have been written originally by Thomas because he would have been long dead by that point. And I'm like, okay, so same question, 2 different days, 2 different answers. And so we need to be really careful, because what it is, remember, there's a pool of information out there, and AI is just pulling from this particular answer, but there's all these other answers. It just pulled from that one for that day. It could have pulled from that one for that day. It could have pulled from this one. And so we need to not let it not just replace pastors or teachers' advice, but even you want to check your stuff with the Bible. Your Bible should still be your primary source. And I think we need to be mindful and aware of just how I don't want people to build their faith off of something that a computer tells them, because it's only pulling from the information that is access to and that chose that moment. I don't want you to build your understanding of God, your understanding of Jesus. The implications are too great. So using your AI, but it's not to replace what you read in the Bible. And you want to be always fact checking everything, whether it's pastors, teachers, whoever, with the biblical text itself.
Really well said. We've got one more submitted question here that I want to ask Natasha, but I do want to get back to the cultural questions after that, because I think, Natasha, you have some really, really interesting things to say about culture. So after this question, I'll get back to some of those. But the real GDM asks, what is the best way to answer one of the most popular Muslim objections to Christianity when they say, if Jesus has a God, he can't be God? So maybe I'll take the first stab at this, just to say that this is sort of I think sometimes it's portrayed as almost a gotcha moment. Like, Jesus has said that he has a God, or like he prays to God. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, we've kind of known that for the past 2,000 years. It's not like we haven't read those passages in the Bible where Jesus goes to pray to the Father, and Jesus talks about God and stuff. So we've been aware of that. And I think sometimes it stems from this, lack of understanding of the Trinity, and that Muslims are often taught that the Trinity is a logical contradiction, that we believe in 3 gods, or we believe in 1 + 1 + 1 = 1, and that's a logical contradiction. And I think it's not easy to understand, but at least it is straightforward to understand that it's not a logical contradiction. We don't believe in 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. We believe that there is one God and 3 persons. And you and I, we are one person to one being. So I'm one Matthew to one human being. But for God, he is 3 persons to one being. And so when Jesus is on earth, he is praying to God. Yes, Jesus has God. He has his Father. He prays to the Father. There's also a voluntary submission of Jesus, where he voluntarily submits to the Father, and is portraying kind of this servanthood role that we ought to have towards God as well. We ought to emulate that role. He's giving us an example to follow. So I just don't think there's a logical contradiction here, or any kind of real challenge to the truth of Christianity.
And maybe I'll add on, I think, as Matthew said, I think it comes down to the understanding of how people understand what the Trinity means. And he's right. While there is this Jesus of submitting to the will of the Father, it isn't like when we say we have a God, we are talking about an entity that is outside of us, that is greater than us, that speaks to, that not just communicates, but also directs and tells us what to do. We can't function without it. It is the originator of things. It created us. So there's all of these things that we talk about God. That's not what Jesus is talking about when he's talking about God. Okay. So he's talking about speaking to the Father, but he himself, it's a difference of nature and his essence versus a reference that you and I would have. But God is not the same as me. So when I'm talking about God, I'm talking about something that's completely other. When Jesus is talking about God, he's talking about the other person of the Trinity, and he's talking about that relational aspect that he has with the Father. And so Jesus isn't denying his natural and his nature. Not just, he has a human nature, but he also has the divine nature. He's not denying any of those by saying he is something different, and this God is over him. This God created him, and this God, tells him what to do because he doesn't know the future. That's not what he's saying. It's a reference to that relation that he has with him. And so I think Matthew's right. It comes down to just this this lack of understanding of what the Trinity is, which I get. I've been asking the same question since I was a kid, as I said earlier. Okay. I get it. Like this understanding of these things. And it's just hard because nothing in earth exists in the way God does. And so it's hard for us to fathom that or to imagine his existence being something different. So I think that's probably what I would say, is to help them understand that Jesus is talking about the Father, which, by the way, is a reference. When you say Father, that's a reference to a being who redeems. Okay, because that was the role of the Father. The Father was the one who went outside of his whole household, paid the money or the ransom, whatever needed to be done to bring people back into his household. That's how the Old Testament refers to Father. And when Jesus is talking about Father, he's referencing this is the Redeemer. So there's a whole relational thing that's very different than a God that exists outside of us that we talk about when we think of God.
Well said. That's great. Well, I want to get to some of these cultural questions. And again, this is a interactive discussion. So if anybody wants to ask questions to Natasha or any of us about these issues of faith and parenting, worldview, culture, these topics, please submit those. But Natasha, you are so good on the culture. I think I love your book here, Faithfully Different, but also your new book on When Culture Hates You. And I wanted to start with this question. Why do you think there are so many Christians who intuitively know something is wrong culturally, but they struggle to articulate why?
Well, I guess there could be a lot of different answers to that depending on the person that you're talking about. But I think overwhelmingly Christians are a little naive in terms of just taking words at face value and thinking that we all mean the same thing by them. And in reality, the culture is using a lot of words that have a different definition to them than they would to us. So you take something like the word justice, for example, and Christians immediately think, well, yes, justice, that's important to God. God cares about justice. This matters. And of course, that's true. But we don't always realize, well, culture sometimes has a very different definition of justice. Or when you get into any kind of the terminology around, good and bad and right and wrong and harmful and helpful, we hear those words and we're having conversations with people and we're butting heads because somebody else says, no, this is a good thing for people. And we're saying, no, this is a good thing for people. And it's like, why can't we come to agreement? Well, because we have different definitions of good. And a lot of times we just don't understand that we are working with different definitions. And even when we do, I would say that most Christians don't know the underlying reason for that. And the underlying reason that we have different definitions is because we have different standards. So when you talk about any kind of moral language, when you're talking about good and bad and right and wrong and harmful and helpful, that requires some kind of standard to determine how you define those things as right or wrong, for example. And so if you have a different standard, meaning anything other than the standard that God has based on his own character, you're going to often get these words wrong. And I do say often because it's not an always. There are things like we would say feeding the homeless. That's considered a moral good by both the culture and by Christians, right? We can all agree in that case. But if you're using a standard in terms of what the world is saying, you're going to get it wrong a lot of the times. And so that's where you start to see things like, oh, the standard is whatever makes me happy. Okay, well, if it makes me happy to live in a way that, I'm denying my biological sex, for example, and I'm going to take on this chosen gender identity, well, that is going to be different than how a Christian with a biblical worldview is going to see things based on the objective standard of saying, well, this is God's design for people being objective, biologically male or female. So it all really does come back to the standard that you use to determine these things. And I think, back to the original question, why do Christians have trouble articulating their views? It's because we don't understand that we're using similar words but different definitions, and that those definitions are specifically rooted in different standards.
Yep, that's the point. That's great, Natasha. Going back, Elizabeth Anscombe, one of the most prominent female philosophers of the 20th century, back in the 1950s, she was calling for an end to moral discourse until we had an agreed language to use. Because same point, we're using words, the same words, but they mean different things because their reference is different. And it's certainly not gotten any better since then. So a starting point is, what do you mean by that is essential. Before you just start arguing about the issue, you got to start getting clarity on these terms like justice and goodness and right and wrong, things like that. That's really good, Natasha.
Well, and I think to some extent that that confusion about language seems somewhat intentional. That these words have sort of been co-opted or changed in popular narratives. I think of, love is love, or some of these slogans that are shared, and it's a way of, you've got this positive term that everybody has positive associations with. Let me co-opt that and pretend like it means something else and repeat it enough so that it means what I want it to mean instead of what it actually means. Uh, how do we kind of recognize those distortions and repudiate them? Do we try to rescue those terms, or do we use different language to kind of express what we mean? How do we respond to some of those cultural narratives?
Well, I think that we have to distinguish between, because I agree with you, there's a lot of intentional confusion that's happening, and it's
Mm,
coming from people that we would maybe call activists. And so the activists are 100% aware of what they're doing. I mean, you can actually read what they say. It's in their own words where they're talking about how they're going to change the views of people based on like how they're using a language. There is no doubt about that
mm,
whatsoever. And then you have people in the culture who are not activists, but they just accept the language as, yeah,
mm,
this is good or bad and this is right or wrong. And they're just using the language that they've picked up. They're non-believers, but they're going according to whatever the secular, language is. So there are two different groups of people. In fact, this is why, not to go, of course, too much with this, but this is why I've always kind of hated the terminology LGBTQ agenda, because there are a lot of people who might identify as part of that group who don't have an agenda per se. They're
mm,
people who they need the Lord and they're feeling these attractions. And so, because they're not Christians, they're going to have a very different view of whether or not those attractions are acceptable and whether or not it's okay to act on them. But that's very different than LGBTQ activists who absolutely do have an agenda and they're working really hard to normalize certain things in society, change policies, all those kinds of things. But I think that sometimes when we use that language, it can put a barrier between us and kind of the everyday person who
mm,
who is struggling with that. And so I do want to differentiate between the intentional confusion that comes and just kind of the everyday non-believer who's picked up the language because that's what they're doing. So in terms of can we recapture the language, I'm not super optimistic about that in terms of the
mm,
things that are already out there in the wild, certain types of language that you hear all the time. I think that Christians have to be more educated in how to address those things and understand how they're being used in culture. I think that it's a lot harder to take something like, a certain terminology, like you hear LGBTQ community, for example. Everyone says that. And I used to use that terminology also, but since when do we ever call any other group of people a community when it's something that we associate as Christians with sin, for example?
mm.
Right.
Wow.
And so I was convicted of that one day because I found myself always saying that same phrase. So I think there are certain phrases and certain wordings that we shouldn't use as Christians at all because they don't align with what we believe. And that would be an example. There are other words that are just general words that we're going to always have to understand we will use differently because of different standards, like the words of good and bad and right and wrong and harmful and helpful. And then there are some words that have not become accepted yet in the society that we actually need to really push back against. And this comes to mind because I've been doing a lot of in-depth research for my next podcast episode, which is going to be on the normalization of pedophilia. And what they're working
Mm,
to do is to relabel pedophilia, basically minor attracted persons. And this is not far enough along in the acceptance level in society that people are overwhelmingly using it. So we have an opportunity as Christians to really push back on that in the normalization efforts. So I think it's a little bit of a complex answer to the question, but you can't bucket it all and say we should push back on everything. It depends on the nature of the terminology. Stop using language that we shouldn't be using at all. Accept that there are language issues where we're going to have different standards, and then where we can push back, where we don't have already the acceptance, then on those things we should definitely work to do that.
mm. That's really good, and I think you're exactly right. Like trying to reclaim the rainbow flag, it's like, well, good luck on that, you know. But when it comes to some of these things that are not yet ingrained, I think this actually takes us back to the AI conversation and some of the phrasings that we use when we say I was having a conversation with ChatGPT. It's like, no, you weren't. You were typing in a prompt and you were getting a probability response. It was not thinking. It
Yeah.
wasn't doing deep thinking. It wasn't and I think even with AI, I think it's helpful to have kind of a pause and to try to describe those things in the right way so that we're not framing it as a person, because that's also the way that a lot of these the culture is going to go. I think culture is going to get to the point where AI, I mean, it's already indistinguishable with a human for a lot of people. When you're having you put the chat GPT on the voice conversation, you can have what sounds like a conversation. And when those are put into androids, when those are put into machines, there's going to be a machine rights movement, I think, where people are going to say these are people. You already see that in sci-fi. I think of the movie, one of my favorites from the past few years, The Creator, where it's kind of the question of this movie is, look, these machines seem like people. Shouldn't we treat them like people? They ought to be treated like people. And it's a dangerous kind of road to go down, because then what is a person? Is it just something that mimics humans? Is it something that just mimics conversation? No, we have to have a robust view of what a human person is, so that when we think about these things, we're not deceived. And like you said, many people are being deceived. They're having relationships or pseudo relationships with these machines, and it's leading them down very, very dark paths.
I'll be looking forward to that podcast, Natasha. If this is what you said, I'm with you. I don't think it's a long shot that they make movement on that with minor attracted or what it. Well, I've already lost
Minor
it.
Attracted person.
Minor attracted persons. They're
Persons.
following the exact same
Blueprint.
process as the transgender movement has. I mean, it's like by the book, the exact same, thing. It's really remarkable to look at. And so I'm kind of talking about the parallel paths there, because a lot of Christians think, oh, that will never happen. Well, it hasn't happened yet, the acceptance, but they're following the same exact path as the transgender movement did. And we see where that has gotten us. So it's the next logical step in the sexual revolution. It absolutely is. I mean, it follows the exact same underlying assumptions, to the degree that if you've accepted all of those things in the sexual revolution, there's no reason you shouldn't accept minor attracted persons. There's no reason you shouldn't accept that sexuality is just a social construct, and age is all relative, and we're right now just like harming children in some way because we're not allowing for their sexual liberation. I mean, these are the things that people are talking about, and it sounds far-fetched only because we haven't gotten to the tipping point on it yet. But it's the exact same underlying presuppositions in terms of worldview and sexual identity rooted in Freud and Kinsey and everything from the last 100 years that leads to this. It's just the next step.
Yep.
Well, and I hope that could be a turning point for some people to realize, wait a second, the same logic that supported this is going to support that. And maybe, just maybe, this could be a moment where they kind of jump the shark and they go a little too far, and people realize, wait a second, this is not okay. This is not a good path to be going down. We need to go back. We need to go back to biblical morality when it comes to these things. But I do think that biblical morality is so often portrayed as harmful or hateful, and it's just maligned. How do Christians sort of respond to that? How do they recapture the goodness of the Christian biblical ethic when it comes to sexuality, identity, these sorts of things?
Well, that's a big question. I think that you could answer it on two different levels. So, one is as a culture, like how do you impact the culture? And one is on a personal level when you're talking with people. So I'll just briefly address each of those. If you're talking to someone personally and they're saying, hey, you're harmful, you're hateful, the best thing that you can do, honestly, is to ask the questions like, Mike was saying, like, well, what do you mean by that? How do you define what is harmful or what is hateful? Because the more that you try to understand what they're saying, the more you'll be able to address it. So one thing that I always encourage people to do is to, before you ever express your view, ask enough questions that the person knows you're trying to understand, and then see if you can accurately articulate their position. So once you've asked all these questions, then you get to a point of saying, okay, just to make sure that I understand what you're saying here, you believe that when I say X that this is harmful because, and then you're repeating their language, and you want them to be shocked by how well you understand them before you ever reply. And I've seen this work many times. This is a great parenting tip, by the way, that if you can do this with your kids too on just everyday kinds of issues and say, so if I understand you correctly, blah, 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 and they'll be like, yes. And my daughter one time was like, so why don't you agree? Like, if you understand, why don't you agree with me? Right. And that's how a lot of people feel about any issue. And so you want to show that you really understand that. And then you, without even having to make it about, now here's what is truth directly, you can say, okay, so here's where we differ in our understanding. When I'm defining what is harmful to someone, I am doing that with respect to who I believe a person is. So because I'm a Christian, I believe that the Bible is actually God's word, that the God of the universe, who has created and sustained all things, has actually revealed all kinds of things that we need to know about the nature of reality in the Bible. So I'm going to go there to see what a human being is and what kind of purpose we have, and how God would define what is harmful or helpful to the human beings he created, because I believe he has the ability and the right to do so. So when I go back to what scripture says, and then you can continue from there, right? So you're explaining how you got to your view before you're ever even saying, well, here's what's true, or here's what I believe is true. I actually really dislike saying, here's what I believe is true in terms of like those exact words, instead of explaining how you got to it through believing. I mean, you're starting with saying, I believe that, that God is the one, but then you're explaining the whole logic flow of that if it's like a conditional, if that's true, if the Bible is God's word, and if God created people, and if he said these things, then this would be harmful to people. This actually would not be hate, but this would be love, because you're wanting God's best for them. So sometimes when we take that opportunity to actually outline the logic and how it flows like that, it's not so much about you putting forward your view, but you explaining your thought process, so that the hope is that they can explain and articulate to you just the same way you articulated to them. And then maybe you get into more of the apologetics question after that to say, well, how do we know who's right here? That's a traditional apologetics question, right? But before you ever get there, it's like, let's understand each other's views and how we got to them. And that will help people to understand that a little bit more. On a cultural level, this is a really difficult question, right? Because you're trying to impact the culture for the common good when people hate what is actually good, according to God's standards a lot of times. Sometimes on certain issues, and I think that this is a good one for when you're talking about transgender issues and policy questions, for example, someone might not agree with you on anthropology. They might not agree with you in terms of, well, God made people and this is who a person is and there are two biological sexes. They might not even understand that or agree with that. But when they see videos of a biological male playing in a woman's sports and just throttling someone who is a female, they start to just intuitively sense like, I don't agree with that. I don't, that's not right. That's not fair. They might not articulate why it's not fair and not right, but they're seeing firsthand that there's a problem with this. So some of the times when we're trying to move the culture, we can use some of those levers where people are sensing things, even if they don't agree with all of the underlying presuppositions we have, that they're actually going to come to the same conclusions on some of those things, maybe for different reasons. And so we can work together in terms of shaping policies. So ultimately, it's only when people give their lives to Christ that they're going to come to a biblical worldview and see things that, the same way that hopefully that any Christian would. But there are movements in the culture that we can make by appealing to sometimes common sense, sometimes that, Romans 1 understanding that's just deep down about the nature of truth, and try to get people to suppress it a little less.
It's really good. I think I've definitely noticed that the kind of here's why I believe what I believe kinds of conversations, they lower the temperature a little bit, because then you're just explaining why you believe what you believe. And you're not just saying, here, you need to believe this. It's here's why I believe this. Can I share with you? Can I tell you? I think about even just during the height of some of the cancel culture that was happening on college campuses, where people were being deplatformed, and there was a large kind of movement for this. We were getting into a lot of these secular campuses like Berkeley University in California and some of these really secular universities, and speaking on some of these topics. And we weren't facing that hostility. And I think it was because we were explaining why we believed what we believed, rather than simply telling people, turn or burn, and you need to believe this. And then we were open, this is what we believe, but we were having some of those why conversations, and I think people found that to be pretty refreshing. So
Yeah, I think that's a great tactic, and anybody that applied that today, I think would find it helpful. You're wrong because put somebody in a defensive posture. Oh yeah, no, I'm not. Do you
Mhm.
mind if I tell you why I believe? That starts the conversation in puts the listener in a curious position, possibly.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think it's a great move, and it's loving and respectful to try something like that. So when you use the word tactic, we're not talking about anything manipulative or cunning. It's just a respectful, helpful approach
Yeah.
to keep, emotions down and keep people's guards down. I think that's really good.
Well, and I think it speaks to this question that was submitted: how do we do this in a everyday lives without we being tactful, without coming out as pounding people over and driving them even further from biblical truth? It's, I think, when you are ready to share your perspective and here's why I believe what I believe, but you have to have that why, right? And this goes back to the beginning of the conversation with Natasha, just that a lot of Christians don't have a why. They have a, well, this is, I was raised this way, or I go to church, or I read my Bible, or they have a why, but it's just so personal that it's difficult to share with others. And I think that's why we have to actually worship the Lord with our minds, study the reasons, and learn apologetics, learn why we believe what we believe, so that we can articulate to others.
And just to, this is nagging me in my mind, just to make sure I don't overstate a position. There are certainly times for you're wrong because, and you just need to
Sure.
use wisdom in your relationships and the platform that you're given. Is this an opportunity where I need to use can I tell you why I think what I think? Or is this an appropriate case for I just need to be as clear as I possibly can be? You're wrong because moment, and trust the Lord to guide you in that, following the direction of the Holy Spirit in times like that.
It's really, really good.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an awesome conversation. We are running out of time, but I wanted to ask you, Natasha, do you have some new projects or different books that you're working on that you're excited about?
Well, I spent the last 10 years writing 5 books, and so I'm actually taking a little bit of a break right now, but I am looking forward to writing
Nice.
more
Wow.
books because I love writing. I'm an introvert, and so for me, that's kind of the best thing that I like to do. And so I do definitely plan on writing more books, and I'm just not sure exactly what the next topic's going to be, but I have some things that I'm tossing around in my brain. So if anyone has any requests, let me know.
Very
Awesome.
cool.
Well, I think you're really, really interesting on that AI conversation. So we might need more guidance on that topic, and maybe that's a future topic for you. That'd be great. Well, how can people find out more about your ministry as well?
Well, I have a website that's kind of the hub for everything. It's natashacrain.com, and Crane is spelled Crain, not like the bird. And I have a podcast, the Natasha Crain podcast also. And Elisa Childers and I do a joint podcast periodically called the Unshaken Faith Podcast.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Natasha. And thank you,
Right.
everyone who tuned in. Again, this is the Ask an Apologist podcast and live stream. And so if you tune in, we do this once a month. We have different guests on and we ask them questions, and we have a great conversation, and you can submit your own questions. So we thank you for everyone who submitted a question. Sorry we didn't get a chance to answer everyone's question, but thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next month. Thanks so much.